Welcome to The Good Word. My name is Vincent Goodwill, senior NBA reporter for Yahoo Sports, the host of this podcast. We are part of the Ball Don't Lie podcast. Get us wherever you get your podcast and, of course, your NBA content. It is Monday. Usually we have a guest on Monday, and Wednesday is the solo show, but because it's All-Star Weekend and also because we've got a little surprise for you, we're going to flip things up. So today it's going to be me and a little bit of producer John, of course, and Wednesday you will see what I'm talking about. We got a little bit of news to get into, at least before we start talking about the main topic today. Mitch Kupchak stepping down in Charlotte to become an organizational advisor. The Hornets are going to hire a new head of basketball operations. Remember, new ownership group with Michael Jordan stepping aside a few months ago. So this was going to be expected. I would expect the Charlotte Hornets to look completely different. They haven't had much of an identity for the past several years, almost since they've come back. They've had more of an identity since they were the Bobcats, but that's not a high bar to cross. Miami's Jimmy Butler taking a leave of absence for the death of a family member. He missed yesterday's game against the Celtics, the National League televised game on ABC. His agent, Bernie Lee, sent out a statement before the game just saying that Jimmy was going to be taking some time out because of the death of the family member. Like, life happens. And I think sometimes we forget that. Not sure how long he's going to be away, but with All-Star Weekend coming up, not to say that there's a good time to deal with it, but I don't think he wasn't named as an All-Star. He wasn't named as an All-Star replacement. He always says he doesn't care about being an All-Star. And he kind of had that discussion this week when people asked him about it. And I'm sure if whatever was hanging over his head with him and his family, I'm sure that probably heightened how he felt about any talk about All-Star Weekend. So guys have to deal with stuff. And, you hope for the best. You hope Jimmy can come back with a clear mind and can properly grieve for his situation. Now to the basketball, John. Spencer Dinwiddie was sitting with Rob Pelinka the other night at Crypto.com Arena on the night that Kobe's statue was unveiled. I remember right after Kobe died, I was still living in New York at the time, John. And we were this was like in that weird space, right? The weird space after the death of Kobe Bryant and before COVID hit. It was like the death of Kobe, then All-Star, and people were talking about this virus or whatever. And then like a couple weeks after that, boom, everything ends. But everybody was getting like different reactions from players. And one of the most emotional reactions I remember seeing was Spencer Dinwiddie after a game. And Spence was talking about how Kobe approached him after a game and told him how much he admired him and respected him and how he had earned, Kobe's respect. Spencer Dinwiddie was in tears talking about this at his locker after the game. So for Spence to be in LA on the day his idol's, statue was being unveiled and dedicated in that really beautiful ceremony that a lot of people saw on NBA TV or wherever you saw it, that was in LA. It was almost seemed like a foregone conclusion that Spence was going to sign with the Lakers, just the emotional pull of all that. I'm very curious to see, John, how effective he's going to be. He's a guy who plays with the ball. Like, he's really effective when he can play with the ball. I don't know if there's going to be much of that with LeBron and AD and also D'Angelo Russell, who's been playing really, really well. And it's not like a difference-making acquisition. I think it's one for depth. And I think he is going to play. I'm very curious to see how it works out. Because, John, it looks like the Lakers are just destined for the play-in.
Yeah, is there any reason to believe they can overtake any of the teams above them, really?
Is there a reason to believe that they will they will hold off rather the team that's directly behind them that we're going to get to and talk to with a little bit of layering. I don't know.
That's true. One day I want, and this is probably an off-season thing, one day I want to dive into the Lakers bubble title with you, because I think there's like some interesting threads there that aren't really explored, but
Okay.
I threw this in the rundown, so I might as well say it on the podcast. Here's where the Lakers have finished the regular season every year since LeBron James signed with them. 10th, 1st, that was the bubble championship year. 7th, 11th, 7th. And they're currently 9th. So I don't think they're probably destined to be a top 4 or top 6 team. They didn't make any sort of big moves at the trade deadline that would make me think that they're about to take off on a 10-game winning streak or something like that.
Ain't no heater coming, John.
No, and Spencer Dinwiddie is not moving the needle all that much. And I think I was telling you before we recorded, being a Mavericks fan, Spencer Dinwiddie's time with Dallas is fun because he was a very effective player for the Mavericks. But he also shot 40% from 3 with the Mavericks, which he has never come close to doing anywhere else. He's basically a 31, 32% three-point shooter everywhere else except for the almost a full season he spent with the Mavericks. So I don't know what Lakers fans are expecting, but I don't imagine you're going to get the 40% from 3 version of Spencer Dinwiddie. And I don't think you're going to get the pre-ACL tear, borderline all-star guy with the Brooklyn Nets, Spencer Dinwiddie. I think he's kind of a shell of himself at this point.
I mean, when he first came into the league, the fact that Spence has been able to carve out this type of NBA career, because he had major knee surgery when he was in Colorado. And then to come in and, at a point, being traded from Detroit to Chicago, maybe for Cameron Bairstow. Like there's a lot. Like, you can often tell some stories about what players you were traded for, what your value was around the league at a certain point. So for Spence to turn into a borderline all-star, to be a valuable cog for that Dallas Mavericks team that went to the Western Conference Finals, when I tell you they put Phoenix out of their misery that year and completely blitzed them in that Game 7 in Phoenix, where you were looking up, you're like, man, Phoenix has barely scored. It's a 20-point game in the first quarter. They're not going to turn things around. Spencer Dinwiddie was a huge part of that. And like you said, atrophy, knee injuries, those things happen too. So speaking of homecomings, because Spencer Dinwiddie is a LA kid and he's going to play for his hometown Lakers, Kyle Lowry reaching a buyout with the Charlotte Hornets after being traded for Terry Rozier. He's signing with his hometown team. Y'all hear Freeway in the background. The Philadelphia 76ers, the North Philly kid. Kyle will sign for $2.8 million, which of course will be prorated towards the end of the season. He's going to reunite with Nick Nurse, who he won a championship with in Toronto. I'm not sure how good Kyle Lowry is. Like, you could see bits and spurts of him in Miami. When he got it going in Miami, when he was making plays, when he was being the guy that was being really disruptive on defense, drawing the charges and everything else, you could see that was in like an added dimension of what Miami was able to do, especially last year during that run to the finals. But this is what happens when you're 6 feet tall and you are 30 plus years old, you're 37 years old. Like, this is what happens. We're going to talk about another short player in a little while, but the one thing about Kyle, he can shoot the 3. He is shooting 39% from 3 this year on 4.5 attempts. That will be critical. That will be a small backcourt when he and Tyrese Maxey are on the floor together. And Philly's just looking for reinforcements right now. Like, that much is clear. We don't know how long Joel Embiid will be out. We don't know how long, due to this procedure that he's had, how effective he's going to be when he comes back, if he comes back. Philly looks like one of those teams, especially with Cleveland surging. Philly looks like one of those teams that's going to slide down to the play-in. And if Embiid is back by that point, maybe you have some veteran know-how. Maybe in a one-game scenario, a guy like Kyle Lowry can really push you over the top if things are close. If Joel Embiid comes back and it's a one-game situation, I know Joel Embiid has had his issues in the postseason, but in a one-game scenario, I'm sure that's not a team you really want to face, because for one game, maybe he can rev it up if he's there, if he's healthy, if his body is fresh. It's just an interesting thing. Now we're going to get to the crux of the show, because, John, I yelled audibly in my living room Saturday night. And I feel like Colonel Jessup when he said, grave danger, is there any other kind? How do you yell besides audibly, right? Yes. It's just something when Steph hits one of those clutch shots, and I know there's this online narrative that Steph doesn't hit clutch shots, and it's dumb. But when he hit that three off a really bad pass from our buddy Pods, that was a really, really terrible pass, a really terrible overplay from Bradley Beal, and Steph barely looked at the rim. He halfway turned. It was like he pirouetted. Like literally, he just spun around like a figure skater and looked up and shot it. It was amazing. And the shot was a missile. It wasn't one of those like soft makes. It was like that was worth Mike Breen going bang, bang. It was worth a double bang. I think he just gave us one. And I literally yelled audibly, like, oh, not because you're rooting for anything. It was such an amazing shot. What'd you get, John?
Two things. One, everything you're describing, I love, because this is why we all got into this. Like, why you got into this, why I took a job as a NBA podcast producer. Like, these are the moments that we love and we live for, right? And these are the moments that make the league the league. I just want to point out one quick thing, because this has been my like soapbox all year. Is I'll see like a video of someone showing off like Jokic pass highlights and like, man, how does he do it? He's a wizard, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, he can do it because he practices it. Like he's not just coming up with it. Like I saw Luka was on JJ Redick's podcast and JJ Redick was trying to get it. And Luka was just like, I don't practice this stuff. Like I'm built different, right? But Jokic practices this stuff. Luka practices a lot of the stuff. Steph, I don't know if you saw this. Steph practices this. He has a thing where he turns his back to the basket, someone gives him the ball, and then he's, without having any idea what the basket looks like or how far he is, he just has to turn and fire. And so when he made it, I was like, well, yeah, of course he made it. He practices that. That's a thing that he practices. So like, yes, he's a freak of nature, but I also love pointing out that these NBA guys are freaks of nature who do things that they've practiced a million times, and that's why they're able to do them. Yeah,
it's amazing. Like, we lose track, John, of, hey, you're right, Steph practices all these different scenarios where I got to get up a quick shot, and I'm barely looking at the rim, and I'm turning right to left, or I'm turning off this shoulder, so it doesn't feel so foreign to him. Even still, the fact that this man who's going to turn 36 in a month is doing all of this and still has like a legit hunger, a legit insatiable appetite. And we got into this really bad basketball conversation a couple of nights ago. Maybe it started on ABC. Maybe it started with Stephen A. and Bob Myers about Kevin Durant not getting credit, and Kevin Durant leaving Stephen Curry's team and all that stuff or whatever. And I think the important thing to point out is that Stephen Curry is a better basketball player today than he was during those early championship Warriors years. He can't reach the high note, right? If Steph is a lead singer, you know what I mean? Like, he can't reach those high Ronald Isley, Aretha Franklin, Whitney Houston notes all the time. Like, he was a better athlete back then. He's a better basketball player now. Like, the way that he can manage a game now. And he's not really, game manager. Like, one day we're going to get into this when we talk about historical point guards one day, y'all, when y'all are ready for those conversations, and I'm going to thank Cam Newton for this, because there's some point guards who are game managers and some point guards who are game breakers. And not that I'll break it down exactly in the same way, but Steph is definitely a game breaker, right? But he has learned to manage a game within the game in ways that he did not do back then. He was just playing back then. He was playing with the exuberance, with the joy. The Warriors were breaking the league. Remember, they light years ahead and all this other stuff. Now everybody's playing the basketball the same way. The Warriors don't have that schematic advantage of we're just going to shoot threes and we're going to play small and everything else. We have to play the game a little different. Steph is a better basketball player. His knowledge of the game, the way that he's out here playing, you can see it. He's not going to be hitting shots at a 44% rate from three like he used to. But I think he's a better basketball player than even when Kevin Durant was with them. I firmly believe that. And here's the other thing about this, John, that I find hilarious. Y'all, we don't have to do revisionist history either. You may not like the choices Kevin Durant made. People didn't like when he got to Golden State. People didn't like when he left Golden State. That man can't do right for nobody, right? But we not going to sit up here and lie and act like that wasn't the baddest dude walking. We not going to sit up here and act like, oh, he was just on Stephen Curry's team, like he was just a cog, like he was Harrison Barnes. No. That dude was the baddest man walking, okay? Period, point blank. We can just leave that there. Baddest dude walking. Now, to the Warriors. John, it might be really hard for them because they're 25-25 at the time of this recording. They are destined to play the Lakers in the play-in. And I feel like it's kind of headed there anyway. I'm not sure how consistent Golden State will be able to be for the last 32 games of the year, but you kind of feel like they're starting to figure stuff out. You feel like they are morphing themselves into a different version than the team that won a championship a couple years ago, than the team that last year was wrecked from the inside because of everything that happened in the preseason with Jordan Poole and Draymond Green. So they're morphing themselves into a new version. Klay Thompson is coming to grips with his basketball mortality, right? He can still go on heaters, but he's not chasing the heaters anymore. At least he shouldn't be chasing the heaters. He's chasing the heaters. He's chasing the max contract. Like, he's chasing all of that stuff at his age. If he's not doing that and he settles into a player who can maybe explore the mid-range a little bit more, maybe get to the basket a little bit more, then he's a much more effective player than the one that's just catching and shooting and chasing and hunting those threes. They're 6-1 in their last 7 games, right? Their net rating in February, 3rd best so far. And granted, February is a weird month because of All-Star and everything else. And you're curious if they're going to be able to maintain their momentum that they have in this month going into the break, that, you know, if you take a week off and guys go to Cancun or Bora Bora or whatever, you know, do you wind up coming back with that same momentum, right? But that 3rd best net rating, I think that number is real behind the Cavs and Mavs. And one day we're going to have a conversation about the Cleveland Cavaliers. And defensively, that's where you're looking at this team. That's where you're looking at Draymond playing the 5, which he could only really do in spurts back then when they had the vaunted death lineup. I won't tell you who created the term the death lineup, but it's probably the host of this podcast. All right. But back then, you could use the death lineup in spurts and maybe 15 minutes a game. And in those 15 minutes, the Warriors would just overwhelm you and they would just run away and hide. But Draymond couldn't do it for 25 minutes, for 30 minutes. It was just too taxing on his body at that point. Even Draymond at a younger age, right? Because the players and the bodies were so different back then. Even though it was 8 years ago when the Warriors were unleashing the death lineup before Kevin Durant got there and won 73 games, 5s were different in the league. So Draymond, even doing that, there was only so many minutes you could use that without wearing down Draymond. Now he's playing almost the 5 exclusively. and you putting them out there with Wiggins long and rangy and can sometimes play a position up. And Jonathan Kuminga, who's beginning to be unlocked finally by Steve Kerr, right? They're a lot more dynamic in February than they were in December. And since Draymond has been back after the culmination of all the incidents, the Yusuf Nurkic, the Rudy Gobert, all of those things, and he took his time away, he's been on not only his best behavior, but he's been really, really effective, and the Warriors have been really, really effective with him. They are almost 6 points per 100 possessions better with Draymond on the floor. They're almost 7 points per 100 possessions better when Kuminga is on the floor. And adding that level of dynamic athlete unlocks some things with the Warriors because, A, they're always going to heavily switch. And yes, Kuminga has some, silly fouls sometimes. But I think, A, when you haven't been playing for a couple of years, yeah, you kind of got to feel your way around it. And luckily, Steve Kerr has unleashed him. Now, some people will say, Steve Kerr came to his senses or Kuminga has matured or whatever it was. But since Kuminga basically said, hey, man, this ain't it, Steve Kerr's been forced to put him out there, and it's worked to their advantage. And I don't know if this is a team, and I've said it before. I said it on Twitter after the game, and of course the league shall strike me down by saying this, John. 5-game series in the first round. Just give me that. If you've got a play-in tournament that determines the 7 and 8, you can give me 5 games in the first round. I'm tripping. I know I'm tripping. It's about the money. But John, 5-game series first round makes too much sense for me.
I would love a 5-game series in the first round. That'd be wonderful. Also, I keep thinking of something Marcus Thompson said when he was on this podcast like a month ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought of it the other night when I saw, did you see that clip where Clay was talking about not closing out games and how hard that is for him?
Mm-hmm.
And Draymond yelled from the other side of the locker room that he didn't get to close out game 5 of the NBA finals and basically like grow up. Basically yelled at Clay, grow up. When Marcus was on, he was like, there was always a little bit of something going on in the Warriors locker room, is I think how he put it. There's always a little bit of something going on in the locker room, but basically it spun out of control last year with the Jordan Poole situation and the punch and all that. I think that little bit of something, and some of this comes from Draymond, some of this comes from Steph, some of this comes from Kerr, some of it comes from Clay. I think these guys are all like, hey, if we are just brutally honest at all times with each other, and if we got to have a fight, we have a fight, but everything's out in the open, everything's honest, we are so smart and so talented that we can figure this out. And last year, I think the brutality outweighed the honesty. But this feels like the Warriors from 2 years ago. This feels like the Warriors that won a title. Now, I'm not saying they're going to win a title. The West is way more talented this year than it was 2 years ago. But I watch them do stuff like that, call each other out, slowly get better. Kuminga basically demands a trade because he's not playing enough. And now he's playing a bunch and he's playing well. And you can see that someone sat him down and had a come to Jesus conversation with him saying, we need you here to be a part of a potential title run. But if you want us to trade you to Charlotte or Detroit so you can go play meaningless basketball games instead, like that's on you, but you're also going to be hurting this team here. And I think he's like, all right, cool. Like I'll buy in. I want that title. I want to be part of something special. I want my name remembered for the dynasty. I want another parade, like all of that. Right. And there's just a level of maturity that this team has that not a lot of other teams have in terms of the good times and the bad. And I think we see that every once in a while through the little clips in the locker room, them calling each other out, Draymond being loud. And I think there was an opportunity earlier this year for it to really spin out of control. Draymond got suspended. Kuminga's calling for more time. I think even Moses Moody asked for more time, around the Kuminga thing. It was like the next day. And somehow it has all settled down. And that to me is a sign of a very, very mature team that can have these open, honest conversations with each other, sometimes even in front of the media.
Yeah.
And still be on the same page with each other and no one fighting to get what's mine. They're just all pulling in the right direction.
Yeah,
I think
it sounds
that's always
right.
been what we. Yeah, I know that's always what we thought we loved about the Warriors. So it's been nice to see this again from them.
Well, I will say this: they've all been pulling in the same direction, and it all looks good. But it's always icebergs around the corner, right? Sometimes the icebergs are 7-foot icebergs. Sometimes the icebergs are 6 feet tall, right? And you don't know. And we thought, let's start this over. We thought that Kuminga was going to be unlocked because he was going to play with Chris Paul. We thought Moody and Kuminga were going to unlock by playing with Chris Paul, the ultimate point guard stimulus package, right? All this stuff has happened with Chris Paul out, right? Kuminga's averaging, 22 and 5 over the last month. He's up to 16 points a game, right? That's pretty damn sustainable, right? Our buddy Brandon Pajimski, right? Hopefully I said that right? He's averaging 11, 8, and 7 in February. And he's playing starter role, a play in the starter's role. Remember that three-pointer that he took on Saturday night, 2 Saturday nights ago against the Lakers? That's a shot. Now, granted, he missed the shot, and then D'Angelo Russell hit the shot, and it turned. So people were like, "Hey, you playing above your skis?" No, those are shots that he's been taking for a long time. And now you have Chris Paul, who's I think going to be reevaluated in 2 weeks. Remember, Chris Paul evaluated in the next 2 weeks. Gary Payton II came back the other night and was, a pest like he usually is. And Andrew Wiggins finding it a little bit more. So it's back to being, at least for right now, looks like strength in numbers. And the Chris Paul conundrum, it looks like a conundrum because John pointed this out in our pre-show. He said, look, some of the Warriors' best lineups have Chris Paul in them. Absolutely right. But how long ago was Chris Paul playing where those numbers look good? And how well were the Warriors as a unit? And now you're in a spot where you got to maneuver all of this stuff. You have to maneuver whenever Chris Paul does come back because he's really good, because he's a historical point guard. Can you afford to have Chris Paul and Steph Curry in the same backcourt? Chris Paul, Steph Curry, and Klay Thompson on the floor at the same time? You can't. Right? Klay Thompson, all that atrophy, the ACLs, the Achilles, all that stuff. That's where it hurts you on defense. Chris Paul, who always seems to get hurt. I'm going to say it's fault of his own, but he always seems to get hurt. Can you have that? I think it is a very critical time for them, especially, John, if this defense is sustainable. I don't think Chris Paul particularly helps that. And Utah is right behind you. You and the Lakers are essentially neck and neck, right? Essentially neck and neck in the Western Conference. Is neither team wants to play each other. Let's be perfectly honest there. Neither team wants to play each other in a 9-10 matchup, okay? They will do it if it comes up to it. You think LeBron wants to play Stephen Curry in a 1 game? Nah, he ain't trying to do that. He's done that before in an empty gym or half empty gym. And remember he said, John, I shot the 3. I nothing in my eye, all that. Remember that? I saw 3 baskets, that thing.
Oh, yeah.
Neither one of them want to play each other, okay? So how does Steve Kerr balance this new depth lineup, right? The new depth lineup of Curry, of Pods, of Wiggins, Kuminga, Draymond at the 5, plus 40 points per 100 possessions, and they haven't even played 100 minutes yet. How do you balance that out? I don't know.
How would you balance it out? You're Steve Kerr. What do you do? I have an idea, but I want to hear what yours is.
Well, you talked about being brutally honest and saying maybe last year was a little too brutal. I'd bring the brutality back. I don't know. I think you ease Chris Paul back in. Because, I mean, there aren't any minutes that are really bad, but there are moments where you see Golden State getting a little too helter-skelter, a little too wild. And that's where Chris Paul can come in and be like, all right, y'all, let's slow this thing down. Let's make sure we get some level of good shot here. And hopefully he can continue with the growth of Jonathan Kuminga. He can continue, playing with some of those reserves, and he can unlock another level. But I don't want to mess with that new 5-man lineup. I don't want to mess with that at all.
Right. And you kind of nailed what I think is really working for that new lineup is they're very strong on defense and they're very chaotic on offense. And that's always been the Warriors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you look back at this dynasty, it's going to be really good on defense, really smart on defense, really chaotic on offense, unlike any other offense you've played. Like we talk about, everyone plays like the Warriors now because they all play 5 out and they shoot like crazy. No one plays offense as chaotic as the Warriors. No one has. Maybe the Pacers at times, but not even them really. So what I would do, and this is probably what I would have done from the beginning of the season, but especially now that this lineup is working, is I would just do hockey shifts and be like, this is our starting 5. It's this death lineup, right? It's our starting 5. They're going to play, 2/3 of the fourth quarter or the first quarter, and then they're all coming out. And then we're going to have 5 men coming off the bench.
So you'd move Klay to the bench?
I would move, my bench would be Chris Paul, Moses Moody, Klay, Kevon Looney, and I'm missing one, but it doesn't matter. I'm sure they got another wing they can throw in there in the place of like Wiggins. And I would just tell Chris Paul, this is your team. Your job is to make sure with this group of 5, and you can play pick and roll with Looney, with Klay sitting in a corner, and that should be plenty for Chris Paul to figure out an offense. And just be like, hey, we just need you to take this 5-man team and keep us afloat while Steph and Draymond and Pods and everyone rest. And I think that would do a lot. I don't know if that would be enough for Chris Paul for him to be happy. I know there was some talk of that when the Warriors first traded for him of like, hey, maybe just let him run the bench unit. And then he was like, no, I'm a starter. I've always been a starter. I'm going to be a starter. So he probably wouldn't be happy about it. But my idea would be Chris Paul's basically the captain of the bench unit. And we can figure out if he's part of the closing 5 when we get closer to the playoffs and the benches become a little shorter and all that. But for the next 2 months, I would just be Chris Paul, and the bench unit is there to blow your bench unit out of the water.
They got to get there to the playoffs. You're talking about once they get there, they got to get to the playoffs. Like it is, I won't say it's not a foregone. It is not a foregone conclusion that this is sustainable. I believe it is sustainable, rather. But look, Utah's not going away, right?
They're not?
No, we seem to believe that Utah is just going to seed and give that to the Lakers and give that to Golden State. I don't know that to be true. And I look at 7, 8, 9, and 10. Sacramento at 7, your Dallas Mavericks, John, at 8, Lakers and Warriors at 9 and 10. And it is a 4-game gap. That's a lot of games to make up in, 30 games. It is. Sacramento being 4 games ahead of Golden State at 7. That's your play-in. So I don't think Golden State's getting out of the play-in. Even if you count the Pelicans and Suns, I think the Suns are going to sort of sit out. It's fun just the way that the West is siloed. It's like it's playoff races inside of playoff races. Like you get the first 4, Minnesota, Clippers, OKC, Denver, half game away from each other. Then you got 5, 6, and 7 being a half game away from each other, including Dallas, who was at 8. You got Phoenix, the Pelicans, Sacramento, and Dallas. They're a half game and a game away from each other. Then you got the Lakers and Golden State battling. And I don't think anyone's going to get away from the silo that they're in. The silo order will change, but I think with what you see, it's going to be what it is. And And it's more interesting at the top of the West, and it's more interesting at the bottom of the West. The 4 teams in the middle, even the teams that's straddling the play-in, I can see Kevin Durant. I don't want to see Kevin Durant in the play-in. I don't need to see Kevin Durant, Stephen Curry, and LeBron James in the play-in. I don't. Just the basketball fan in me, y'all. I don't need to see all of them there. Not even Luka Doncic, who we can't forget about. Don't want to see him. John, I get people like this whole college style and all that other shit. But I want to see these dudes in real bona fide playoff series come to the end of this. So that's just what I'm thinking so far, especially headed into the All-Star break, and we're going to have right around 30 games left after we come out of All-Star weekend, and then it's going to be a nice sort of rush to the finish line. And that's where the play-in has really, really helped. And I'm sure at some point we're going to get into more about the play-in as we get closer and closer to it. But people are trying to get out of the play-in. You don't want to be in it. The Lakers and Warriors don't want to be in it, but guess what? The teams above them don't want to be in it either. So I think it's going to be really, really, I'm going to be really curious. It's going to be really fascinating to see how the last 2 months or less than 2 months of the season shake itself out before we get into the playoffs. But because we are treating today like it is Wednesday, that means we are giving you the games that intrigue us for the rest of the week. John, of course, has 2 games because he is much more prepared than I. John, let's hear your games.
I always come with 2 games just in case you want one of mine, then I still have one left. There are 2 games that I view as like measuring stick games over the next few days that both involve the Clippers. I think tonight, because you talked about this like last week, I think. The Clippers right now are playing like the best team in the NBA. And I think the Timberwolves, who you said last week, they're getting a little shaky. I think the Timberwolves tonight are trying to prove, hey, we can play with the best. And I think you're going to get the Timberwolves' best punch against a Clippers team that kind of throws their best punch every night. So that's going to be really interesting to me to see where that ends up. And then this Warriors team that we talked about, on Wednesday, they play the Clippers. They're wondering if this is real too. 6-1 in their last 7. Defense has been great. Draymond has been able to keep himself mostly in check. They have this new death lineup where they've moved out Clay and they've moved out other people and they moved in new guys, and it's really working. Does it work against the Clippers? Because at the end of the day, if it doesn't work against the Clippers, it doesn't really matter if your end goal is to win the title. So those are 2 games. I'm apparently going to be watching a lot of Clippers basketball this week. Those are 2 games that I'm ready to see who comes out looking like the better team.
Yeah, especially, and here's another point about Golden State. Klay Thompson last year of his contract, Steve Kerr without a contract, when coaches rarely go into lame duck years, especially decorated coaches in this new coaching economy. This could be the last of these Warriors as we kind of sort of know them. So there's going to be added weight to all of this whole march to the finish line. Like, I think that they're not calling it last dance, right? You can't call it last dance, but it kind of feels like last dance-ish. Like, in 20 years, we're going to find out who Scottie Pippen really don't like. My bad. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that, John. I'm sorry, John. I shouldn't have said that. I hijacked the whole thing, right? Shouldn't have said that. But here's my game. My game is tonight, Denver, Milwaukee. Remember, Doc Rivers going to coach the Milwaukee Bucks. His first game, I believe, was against the Denver Nuggets. And that was a competitive loss. And Milwaukee was very, very encouraged after that. But they haven't really gotten much better since. I think they've won 2 games. I think they're 2-5. They've acquired Pat Beverly right at the trade deadline from Philly to help shore up their perimeter defense. And there's no greater test if you fancy yourself as a championship team, especially one that's trying to, put together some sweat equity, put some, adding bricks to things and seeing what type of house you got. Then against the Denver Nuggets, because we know that team knows itself. And that team knows itself so much that Nikola Jokic didn't even have to turn his head when poor Austin Reeves decided to gamble because he saw Jokic with his back turned and he didn't realize that Jokic is an alien and left Michael Porter Jr. wide open. Like, this Nuggets team gets under talked about sometimes because they were sitting fourth in the West. But now, y'all, they're right in that thicket of Oklahoma City, Minnesota, Clippers, and then the champs. Who you betting against? Because I ain't betting against the champs. We talked about the Clippers last week. The one team that if I were the Clippers that I would not want to see would be Nikola Jokic's Denver Nuggets. So it'll be a really good test tonight for the Milwaukee Bucks to see if they have figured anything out. That'll be a home game. That first game was in Denver. I don't know if this is a finals preview, but theoretically, you could see both teams in the finals just because they're both contenders. They both got to get their stuff together. Milwaukee definitely has to get its ish together. And before we go, I just want to just touch on one small thing. John, on Saturday, I went to the funeral service for Earl Cureton Saturday afternoon. Really beautiful service. A lot of his former teammates were there. Maurice Cheeks was there. Muggsy Bogues got up and spoke. And it was one of those heartwarming things, as much as a funeral can be heartwarming, to see, how loved someone is. And running the jokes throughout the ceremony was, I'll talk to Earl 3 times a day. I'll talk to Earl 4 times a day. Like, when did he get some work done? If everybody's talking to this man every day 4 times a day, either these conversations are really short or that man has figured out a way to do 28 hours in a 24-hour day. But it was really, really, like I said, really heartwarming. Like one of his buddies came up to me who I didn't know. And me and Earl had spent some time together right before the season started. A bunch of us, we had all went out just, trading war stories. When you hang out with guys who play in previous eras, you sit down, you shut up, you listen, you take it in, and you laugh. And it was, and he said Earl had told a friend of his that night was one of the most fun nights that he's had. And, for him to find me after the service and tell that to me, that meant something to me. But one of the prevailing themes throughout the service, John, was St. Cecilia's gym. And for those who don't know, St. Cecilia's gym is basically Detroit's version of the Rucker. It's this indoor, it's a church. It's a church it's a gym inside of a church, pretty much. And Chris Webber grew up playing there. Jalen Rose grew up playing there. There were summer leagues back in the day where people would pack in and get crowded. It's very small. And of course, throughout time and atrophy and everything else, things happen to places like that. It's on the northwest side of Detroit. And Earl Cureton, because he was a child of Detroit, he put a lot of focus into the restoration of St. Cecilia's. And it was one of those themes during the service of, hey, we have to fulfill this mission for him. This is one of the things that, that he was putting his life into. So in a perfect world, John, the Detroit Pistons, the team that employed him, where he was a community ambassador after, he played for a bunch of different teams, but Detroit, of course, was home and the place he called home. In a perfect world, the Pistons would take over that project. But there's always a lot of red tape when you're dealing with archdiocese and, things like that. I remember Jalen Rose was doing some stuff there and stuff got sidetracked. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but still, this place means so much to so many people. And it would be really cool if the money could be pooled to restore, refurbish, and keep St. Cecilia's as the, basketball cathedral that it has been for decades. Those summer league runs, guys, were legendary. I'm telling you, the summer league runs were really special back in it. Like, it's the guys that you didn't know, the guys who were the playground legends, and then Magic Johnson and Isaiah Thomas and those guys would go in there and play, and they would have to play. And I think there's something that we miss when we are in different sort of, I guess, silos being a theme. Basketball is so siloed now. where guys don't run in the summer. Guys don't come and just go get sweaty. And I'm not talking about pros. I'm talking about the high school kids. Everybody's getting individually trained and all sort of stuff. You don't just go to the gym, to any gym, and have to go and maybe take the chance of getting your ass bust out there.
Can I jump in here for a second? Because I have a quick thought. First of all, you referring to St. Cecilia as a basketball cathedral is hilarious to me, because it literally is.
Yes.
Second, I don't remember if this was said on a podcast or one of the times before or after a podcast, but remember leading up to the draft last year, we were doing shows. I was doing shows with Kristen Peak, where she was, basically previewing what she thought was going to happen in the draft and talking about who her favorite prospects were and all this stuff. And I remember her saying, there is a guy in the draft who every single time I go to a run, you know what a run is. This guy's basically playing, right? Every time I go see a run in LA, this guy is there and he's playing. She's like, he almost never works out by himself. He's always just in every single run in the entire city. And she was like, that bodes well for a guy like learning how to play NBA basketball, because he's regularly playing with NBA basketball players all the time. And this is how he's trying to get better and he's trying to learn. Do you want to guess who that player was?
No, who was it?
It's Jaime Jaquez Jr.
There we go. See?
He might get some votes for Rookie of the Year kind of out of nowhere. And when I watch him play, I'm like, yeah, that looks like a guy who plays basketball nonstop with random groups of people and learns how to fit in.
Yes. And you can tell, I promise you guys, you can tell the guys who just play by themselves and the guys who hoop. Jaime Jaquez Jr. hoops. Like, we had George Gervin on the podcast when George was promoting his book a couple of months ago, and he talked about St. Cecilia's. He talked about, sometimes you go in there and some random dude is going to bust your ass. And you don't want that to happen. These kids, I'll tell you the other thing, these kids today, I hate to go old man, these kids don't want to go somewhere and get their ass bust. They don't want to go out here and get exposed.
Except for the hoopers. This is why people have a hard time understanding Kevin Durant. But they totally understand LeBron James. Kevin Durant is a hooper. He'll play all day long. He doesn't care if he loses as long as he gets a chance to beat you after. But LeBron's not really built that way. And a lot of guys in the NBA aren't built that way. And especially a lot of the young guys in the NBA are not built that way.
Yeah, it's just different. It's literally just different now. And, new things become old things become new. Like, I do hope that we can get back to some of, I won't say purity, but I do hope that at some point, basketball can go back to being this game where the competition is so fierce, but the lure of being ridiculed because you didn't show up somewhere, like we got to bring shame back. Shame. You got to bring shame back into grassroots basketball. I don't know if shame exists anymore. You know what I mean? But we got to bring some of that back. So for those who are listening, for those, whether you grew up in Detroit or whatever, or you don't have, or wherever you grew up, wherever there is a quote unquote St. Cecilia's, there is a place where guys came to just run. And sometimes it's the pro-ams, and sometimes it's small gyms, sometimes it's outside. But for Detroit, it is St. Cecilia's. It is hallowed ground here. And I feel like there should be enough basketball royalty around, not just in Detroit, but everywhere else, that if you are hearing my voice, go look up St. Cecilia's. And if it's in your heart, donate a couple bucks to it. But that is all we have for you on today's episode of The Good Word. Thanks to producer John and the entire team that works hard behind the scenes on this show. Dan will be back tomorrow for a new episode of Divine Intervention. And I will be back on Wednesday for a very special episode on Valentine's Day of The Good Word. Until then, everybody be safe.